Welcome, dear listener, to another tranquil journey through the annals of history. As you settle into your cosy bed or favourite armchair, and we get ready to dive into tonight's exploration into the dark underbelly of the past, I invite you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always warming to know how vast our community of nocturnal historians reaches. If you enjoy these calm, meandering explorations of the past, consider subscribing to join our little community of history lovers seeking a restful night's sleep. Tonight, we embark on a quiet, slow descent into the often unseen struggles of everyday life within the vast and powerful Ottoman Empire. Our focus tonight is not on the splendour of the Topkapi Palace, nor the strategic brilliance of its military campaigns, but rather on a more intimate, persistent, and undeniably grim aspect of daily existence for countless individuals. Why daily hygiene was nothing short of a nightmare. When you first picture the Ottoman Empire, your mind might conjure images of exotic spices, grand mosques with towering minarets, vibrant bazaars brimming with silk and gold, and perhaps the majestic Suleiman the Magnificent, presiding over an age of imperial glory. There's a romanticised sheen often cast upon this formidable power, a fascination with its opulence, its unique culture, and its profound influence on world history. But tonight, we must peel away that romantic veneer, to sink quietly into the more visceral realities of life on the streets, in the homes, and within the very skin of the people who called this empire home. For you, were you to be transported back in time to the bustling metropolises like Istanbul, Cairo or Damascus, or even the sprawling countryside villages, the immediate, overwhelming sensation that would assault your senses would be that of the pervasive lack of hygiene. This wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a constant, grinding, and often lethal challenge. A nightmare born of a perpetual struggle against scarcity and systemic oversight. Imagine yourself waking in a small, cramped dwelling, perhaps in the heart of Istanbul in the 17th century. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, refuse, unwashed bodies, and animal waste wafting in from the unpaved streets outside. There would be no crisp, clean linen, no morning shower, no ready access to running water beyond a communal well, or perhaps a distant public fountain. Your personal space, humble as it might be, would be perpetually assailed by dust, insects, and the creeping damp, carrying the spores of mould and the unseen signatures of bacteria. This wasn't an anomaly, nor was it the isolated plight of the truly destitute. It was the daily baseline for the vast majority of the population, from the merchant class to the humblest labourer. The very concept of cleanliness, as you understand it today, the state achieved through diligent sanitation, ample fresh water, and effective waste removal simply, did not exist on a broad, accessible scale. The nightmare began with the fundamental scarcity of resources necessary for basic cleanliness. Water, that most essential element, was a constant, arduous quest. Even in a city as significant as Istanbul, clean, potable water was a luxury, not a given. Aqueducts, while marvels of engineering, supplied water to a select few, leaving the common populace to rely on sources that were often contaminated by waste, human or animal. Rivers running through cities served dual purposes as lifelines and sewers, carrying away refuse while also providing water for drinking and washing. This inherent contradiction created a cyclical trap. You needed water to clean, but the very water you might procure was already teeming with the agents of illness. This systemic flaw wasn't just an oversight, it was woven into the fabric of urban planning and resource allocation. Imperial coffers were more often focused on grand construction, military might, or maintaining internal stability through less savoury means, rather than on universal public health infrastructure. The sheer expense and logistical complexity of providing clean water to millions was deemed insurmountable, or perhaps simply not a priority over more immediate concerns like conquest or tax collection. Furthermore, this nightmare of hygiene was inextricably linked to issues of civic management and endemic corruption. While the Ottomans prided themselves on certain administrative efficiencies, the management of urban environments often fell short of what was required for a healthy populace. Streets were rarely paved, turning quickly into muddy, filthy thoroughfares after rain and choked with dust during dry spells. Animals roamed freely, contributing their own waste to the pervasive grime. Regulations, if they existed on paper, were often laxly enforced or easily circumvented through bribes, leading to unchecked dumping of refuse, animal carcasses, and human waste directly onto public spaces or into waterways. This institutional negligence, whether due to lack of foresight, financial constraint, or outright venality, amplified the physical misery of daily life. The air you breathed, the ground you walked on, the water you hoped to drink, were all compromised. You would constantly be aware of a pervasive, inescapable dirtiness clinging to your skin, pervading your garments, and lingering in every breath. It was a silent, unceasing antagonist, reducing comfort, dulling senses, and perpetually undermining health. This wasn't merely an absence of luxury, it was a foundational breakdown of what you might consider basic human dignity in a material sense. This foundational struggle over water and the inherent issues of public sanitation created an environment ripe for perpetual discomfort and terrifying illness. It was a daily battle, not just against grime, but against the unseen horrors of disease. Your very breath might be tainted by the miasma of refuse, your skin constantly irritated by sweat and dust, and your stomach churning with the fear of yet another bout of debilitating illness caused by contaminated food or water. It was a grinding, insidious kind of suffering, lacking the dramatic flair of a battlefield, but no less devastating in its long-term impact. This initial sense of an overwhelming, inescapable uncleanliness would define much of your existence in the Ottoman world, laying the groundwork for countless other hardships, and becoming the unwritten story of why life, from a hygienic perspective, truly was a persistent, terrifying nightmare. We will delve deeper into each layer of this grim reality, uncovering the struggles over waste, the indignities of personal body odour, and the pervasive creep of disease that plagued this seemingly grand empire. The pervasive stench and visible filth of the Ottoman streets were but outward manifestations of a deeper, more fundamental struggle, the relentless, unending battle for clean water. Imagine for a moment the luxury you experience daily with the simple twist of a faucet, the seemingly infinite flow of potable water available on demand. In the Ottoman Empire, for you and for the overwhelming majority of its inhabitants, such convenience was utterly alien, an unimaginable privilege. The very essence of life, cooking, drinking, cleaning, was tethered to a source that was almost invariably scarce, difficult to obtain, and perpetually suspect. This wasn't just a matter of thirst, it was a matter of survival, a constant anxiety woven into the fabric of every single day. You might wake with a dry throat, a natural biological urge, yet the simple act of quenching that thirst was fraught with uncertainty. Was the water from the communal well still clean after a full day's drawing? Had someone, intentionally or otherwise, discarded refuse too close to its opening? Or perhaps you relied on water fetched from the nearest river, a dark, slow-moving ribbon that also served as a convenient dumping ground for the city's effluent, both human and animal. This direct connection between consumption and contamination meant that every sip, every use of water for food preparation carried a silent, terrifying gamble. Illness was not a distant threat, but a near certainty, stemming from this very struggle to meet the most basic physiological needs. Cities, while magnificent in their architectural endeavours, were often designed with a less than robust understanding of large-scale water management for the masses. Grand aqueducts, monuments to engineering prowess, like those supplying Imperial Istanbul, directed precious mountain water primarily to the royal palaces, the sprawling mosques, and a limited number of public fountains for charitable distribution. For the common dwelling, individual plumbing was a distant future fantasy. You would have to send children, or servants, or yourself to fetch water from these public fountains, a task that consumed considerable time and physical effort. Imagine the endless queues, especially during dry seasons or peak hours, under the scorching sun or in the bitter cold, waiting your turn to fill heavy amphorae or leather skins. This daily chore, seemingly mundane, became a wearying ritual, reinforcing the profound scarcity of what you considered a birthright. The energy expended in simply acquiring enough water for a family to drink, cook, and minimally cleanse was a silent tax on existence. Beyond the communal fountains, private wells existed, particularly in wealthier homes or within the courtyards of larger establishments. Yet, these wells too were susceptible to contamination. With the lack of proper sewage systems, groundwater could easily be tainted by cesspits or latrines situated far too close. Rainwater collection, while common in certain areas, also posed challenges. The open roofs and courtyards designed for collection often accumulated dust, bird droppings, and debris, ensuring that even this seemingly clean source was likely to contain particulate matter and bacterial loads that would be alarming by any modern standard. You are often left with a choice between parched thirst or a sip of something suspect, hoping that your constitution, or perhaps divine intervention, would protect you from the inevitable stomach cramps or fevers that frequently swept through neighbourhoods. The limited availability and dubious quality of water had cascading effects that rippled through every aspect of daily life. Personal cleanliness, as you would define it, was often a compromise, if not an outright impossibility. Washing clothes meant dragging heavy bundles to a river or public wash station, assuming the water there was not too sullied by upstream uses. Even then, the cleansing power was minimal. For bathing, the vast majority of the population might visit a public hammam or bathhouse, a crucial social and hygienic institution that we will discuss in detail later. But even these hammams consumed vast amounts of water and fuel, making them a weekly luxury at best for many, rather than a daily habit. This meant that the accumulation of sweat, dust, grime, and body odours on your skin and clothing was an unavoidable reality, leading to a perpetual state of discomfort. Food preparation, a seemingly innocuous act, became a source of significant health risk due to contaminated water. Washing fruits and vegetables thoroughly, or properly boiling water for cooking, were not always feasible. Foodborne illnesses were rampant, with parasites and bacterial infections a common scourge. Imagine the dread accompanying a meal, not knowing if the very elements intended to sustain you might also betray you, leading to debilitating dysentery, cholera, or chronic stomach ailments. Children, with their weaker immune systems, were particularly vulnerable, and mortality rates for infants and young children were shockingly high, often directly attributable to the ingestion of tainted food or water. The imperial authorities were certainly aware of the problem. They commissioned aqueducts and constructed fountains, often with charitable intent. However, these efforts were akin to placing small, exquisite patches on a vast, frayed canvas. The sheer scale of the population, coupled with limited technology and perhaps a fatalistic acceptance of prevailing conditions, meant that the core problem persisted. There was no widespread understanding of germ theory, no concept of chlorination or filtration on a public scale. You lived with the direct consequences of your environment, a pervasive miasma of bad smells, constant low-grade illness, and the terrifying knowledge that any truly significant drought or the breaking of a critical water supply line could plunge entire districts into a catastrophic cycle of disease and death. The battle for clean water was not one that could be won by the common person. It was a grueling, unceasing struggle against a relentless, invisible adversary. This enduring battle fundamentally shaped your understanding of hygiene, or rather, the constant impossibility of achieving it, making the dream of cleanliness a distant, unattainable fantasy. Having explored the daunting challenge of merely obtaining clean water, we now turn our gaze to its inevitable counterpart. What became of that water once used, and indeed all other forms of refuse, both human and animal? For you, living in an Ottoman city, the problem of waste disposal was a monstrous, intractable beast that fouled the very ground beneath your feet and the air you breathed. There was no widespread, organised municipal waste collection system as you understand it, no fleet of trucks collecting trash, no underground network of pipes whisking away sewage to distant treatment plants. Instead, disposal was often haphazard, localised, and tragically inadequate, transforming vibrant urban centres into breeding grounds for disease, and a constant assault on your senses. Imagine stepping out of your humble dwelling, perhaps on a narrow, unpaved alleyway. Your nostrils would immediately be assailed by a cocktail of putrid odours. This wasn't merely the fleeting scent of something unpleasant, it was a persistent, clinging miasma composed of countless sources. The fermenting remains of discarded food, the acrid bite of animal manure, and the inescapable stench of human excrement. This odour, thick and cloying, would become your constant companion, infiltrating your clothes, clinging to your skin, and even dulling your sense of taste and appetite. It was a tangible presence, an invisible toxic fog that permeated every aspect of your daily life. The primary culprit for this pervasive odour, and a significant vector of disease, was human waste. Indoor plumbing with flushing toilets, a convenience you utterly take for granted, was a luxury enjoyed by virtually no one in the Ottoman world, save for perhaps the highest echelons of the imperial palace, with their elaborate, if rudimentary, latrine systems linked to running water channels that quickly became clogged. For you, and most of your fellow citizens, the chamber pot was a ubiquitous household item. Throughout the night, this simple ceramic or metal vessel would serve its purpose. The grim question, then, was what to do with its malodorous contents come morning. The most common, and certainly the most horrifying solution, was to simply discard it. Depending on where you lived and the unwritten local norms, this often meant emptying the chamber pot directly into the street, particularly if you resided on an upper floor. Imagine the splash and the inevitable runoff trickling down the uneven cobblestones or muddy earth, joining other streams of foul liquids. In wealthier households, or those with more private arrangements, there might be a privy, a rudimentary outdoor latrine usually situated over a deep cesspit. These pits, often dug beneath a building or in a courtyard, were rarely properly sealed or ventilated. They would fill slowly, sometimes over years, seeping into the surrounding soil and, distressingly often, into the shallow water table, directly contaminating the very wells or groundwater sources from which you might draw drinking water. The task of periodically emptying these overflowing cesspits, usually performed by an unfortunate specialist known as a night soil collector, was a notoriously hazardous and vile occupation, often done under the cloak of darkness, to spare sensibilities from the appalling sights and smells. Beyond human waste, animal excrement was another dominant feature of the urban landscape. Cities were teeming with animals. Horses and donkeys served as primary modes of transportation, their droppings a constant addition to the streetscape. Sheep, goats, and even cattle were often herded through thoroughfares or kept in residential areas, contributing further to the pervasive filth. Stray dogs and cats, while perhaps acting as scavengers for some organic refuse, also left their mark. The sheer volume of animal manure, coupled with infrequent rain to wash it away, and a lack of organised street cleaning, meant that roads and marketplaces were perpetually caked in a thick layer of unholy muck. This wasn't just unsightly, it was an incubator. Flies, those tireless carriers of disease, would swarm around these accumulating piles, their legs and bodies brushing against the feces before landing on your uncovered food in the market, on your lips, or in your eyes. Household waste, the scraps from meals, the ashes from charcoal braziers, broken pottery, spoiled foodstuffs, also posed a formidable challenge. With no centralised collection, each household was largely responsible for its own disposal. Often, this meant simply adding to the existing detritus in the streets, tossing it onto vacant lots, or dumping it into the nearest river or canal, assuming the waterways would simply carry it away. These makeshift dumping grounds would attract swarms of rats and other vermin, providing them with abundant food and shelter, turning them into highly effective, four-legged purveyors of pathogens throughout the city. The rivers themselves, beautiful arteries of commerce, became open sewers, their waters polluted with organic matter, choking the marine life and making their banks unpleasantly pungent, sometimes to the point of being uninhabitable. The consequences of this pervasive and unresolved waste problem extended far beyond mere discomfort. It was a primary engine of sickness and premature death. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and a host of debilitating parasitic infections were endemic, their cycles perpetuated by contaminated water sources and the omnipresent fly. You might constantly battle with stomach upsets, intermittent fevers, and chronic fatigue, never truly feeling well. Children were especially vulnerable, their immune systems no match for the constant bombardment of pathogens. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, with many newborns failing to reach their first birthday, their lives tragically cut short by diseases directly attributable to the filthy environments they inhabited. The Ottoman world, for all its grand pronouncements and imperial ambitions, was a landscape where life itself was frequently, brutally, and systematically undermined by the sheer inadequacy of dealing with the waste of human existence. This constant battle against overwhelming grime was a daily, visceral reality, painting a picture far grimmer than the glittering mosaics of grand mosques might suggest. It was a silent, persistent nightmare that wore down body and spirit, making health a fleeting luxury and chronic discomfort an inescapable truth. Having examined the twin scourges of scarce water and rampant waste, let us now turn our attention to the most intimate and personal manifestation of the hygiene nightmare: your own body. Imagine, for a moment, the sensory assault of simply existing within your own skin, within the unyielding confines of the Ottoman world. For the vast majority, the refreshing daily shower or comforting nightly bath, rituals you effortlessly engage in today, were utterly unknown. The prevailing norm was a persistent state of physical grime, body odour, and the unsettling companionship of unseen, creeping infestations. This was not a matter of choice or personal preference. It was the inescapable reality imposed by an era utterly lacking in modern sanitation, and it took a profound toll on comfort, health, and dignity. You would wake, and the first thing you might notice is the persistent stickiness on your skin from accumulated sweat, dust, and the oils your body naturally produced throughout the night. The concept of an immediate cleanse, of rinsing away the impurities of sleep, simply didn't exist for most. Water for even a rudimentary splash of the face and hands was a precious commodity, perhaps from a basin or ewer, carefully conserved. True immersion, the sensation of letting water wash over your entire body, was a rare and coveted experience, largely reserved for the public bathhouses or hammams, and certainly not a daily occurrence for anyone but the wealthiest who could afford their own private bathing facilities or constant attendance. Without regular access to full body washing, body odour would become a pervasive reality. Your own scent, mixed with the sweat and exertions of daily labour, would mingle with the stale air of your home and compound the already oppressive smells of the streets. Imagine standing in a crowded bazaar, the cacophony of vendors and shoppers, and beneath it all, the inescapable, layered scent of hundreds of unwashed bodies, compounded by the odours of animals and refuse. Your personal space, however limited, offered no true escape from this atmospheric reality. Even those who religiously visited the hammam once a week or fortnightly still spent the vast majority of their time carrying the subtle yet distinct aroma of prolonged contact with their unwashed selves. But body odour was merely one, albeit profound, consequence. Far more unsettling and insidiously debilitating was the constant threat and often undeniable presence of ectoparasites. Fleas, lice, and mites were not simply occasional annoyances. They were endemic, omnipresent companions for almost everyone, regardless of social standing. Your skin would itch relentlessly. Imagine the incessant low-level irritation, the frustrating attempts to scratch an elusive bite, the unsettling knowledge that tiny, unwelcome creatures were crawling and feeding upon your scalp, within your hair, or nestled in the seams of your clothing. The presence of head lice, particularly among children, was practically universal. They would proliferate, causing discomfort, disrupting sleep, and leading to persistent scratching that could break the skin, leaving it vulnerable to secondary bacterial infections in an era without effective antiseptics. Fleas, tiny and tenacious, would infest not just your clothes, but your bedding, the mats you slept on, and the very floors of your home. Their bites, small and red, would appear daily, sometimes in clusters, causing a maddening itch. You might attempt to pick them off your clothes or out of your hair, a fruitless Sisyphean task. More insidiously, fleas were known, though not understood by your contemporaries, as primary vectors for diseases. The bubonic plague, that great recurring terror, was predominantly transmitted by flea bites. So, what seemed like a minor irritation, a persistent itch, was, in reality, a direct, undeniable link to the most terrifying epidemic. You lived in a state of unknowing vulnerability, each scratch potentially a fateful brush with the plague or other febrile illnesses. The fight against these parasites was largely futile. Without proper washing facilities, insecticidal soaps, a concept yet to be invented, or a comprehensive understanding of how they spread, attempts at eradication were minimal and ineffective. You might use coarse combs for your hair, or simply endure the irritation, resigning yourself to this unavoidable aspect of life. Clothing, difficult to clean as it was, provided perfect breeding grounds. The very notion of pristine, comfortable clothing was unattainable. Your garments absorbed sweat, dust, and body oils, and became safe havens for countless minute creatures. The texture of cloth would feel different to you, perhaps rougher, less fresh, never truly clean by your modern standards. This relentless struggle against personal uncleanliness and infestation profoundly affected physical comfort, but also, in a quieter way, your mental state. There was no escaping the feeling of being perpetually dirty, a sense of having foreign bodies moving on your skin, a continuous reminder of your lowly place in the biological order. The indignity of itching uncontrollably in public, or waking up to new bites, was a constant, small erosion of your peace of mind. It was a daily, visceral reminder that your body, your very self, was not entirely your own, but rather a host for unwelcome tenants, living in conditions far from what you would ever consider tolerable. This quiet, ceaseless war, waged on your skin, within your hair, and upon your garments, was a uniquely distressing component of the Ottoman hygiene nightmare, rendering personal comfort and true cleanliness a utopian dream. Following the grim realities of insufficient personal hygiene and the constant companionship of body parasites, we turn our attention to the persistent struggle of maintaining the cleanliness of your most immediate environment, your clothes. In the Ottoman Empire, and indeed for much of pre-industrial history, the concept of a regularly laundered wardrobe was an exotic dream. Your garments were not merely a means of covering your body. They were an extension of your daily struggles with dirt, sweat, and infestation. The processes for washing clothes were rudimentary, labour-intensive, and far from effective, ensuring that a pervasive state of uncleanliness permeated every thread, adding another heavy layer to the Ottoman hygiene nightmare. Imagine donning your clothing each morning. It wouldn't possess the crispness, the fresh scent, or the unblemished texture you associate with clean attire today. Instead, your clothes, perhaps simple cotton tunics, rough woolen outer layers, or felted head coverings, would feel perpetually weighted down with the accumulation of previous days and weeks' grime. Dust, picked up from the unpaved streets and crowded markets, would be deeply embedded in the fibres. Sweat, drying, and then reactivating with each day's activity would leave stains and contribute to an unremitting musty odour that clung stubbornly, impossible to truly air out. The visible signs of wear and tear, the discoloration, the occasional tear, would be less impactful than the invisible burden of accumulated human and environmental residue. The technology for cleaning textiles was incredibly primitive. There were no washing machines, no chemical detergents, and no widespread understanding of disinfection. The most common method of washing involved soaking garments in water, the same scarce and often dubious water we've discussed, and then agitating them, often by beating them against rocks or rubbing them by hand. Soap, when available, was typically a crude, harsh concoction made from ash lye and animal fats, not widely accessible or affordable for the general populace. This raw soap often contained impurities, and its effectiveness as a cleaning agent, particularly in removing grease and deep-seated dirt, was limited. The laborious physical effort involved meant that clothes were typically only subjected to this strenuous process infrequently. For many, washing clothes might be a monthly affair, or even less often, dictated by necessity, water availability, or the onset of particularly pungent odours that simply could no longer be ignored. Drying clothes presented its own challenges. In the absence of clothes dryers, garments were laid out in the sun, which offered some degree of sanitisation through ultraviolet rays, but also allowed the ubiquitous dust to resettle on freshly washed, but never truly clean, fabrics. During rainy seasons, or in perpetually damp and overcrowded urban areas, clothes might take days to dry fully, becoming susceptible to mildew and acquiring an unpleasant damp odour that would quickly negate any perceived freshness from the wash. This further reduced the frequency with which people could wash their garments, trapping them in a cycle of persistent dinginess. The cumulative effect of infrequent, ineffective washing meant that your clothes became prime habitats for the parasites we previously explored. Fleas and lice would find comfortable refuge within the uncleaned seams and folds of fabric, breeding and feeding undisturbed. Imagine feeling the telltale itch of these creatures, not just on your skin, but knowing they were living, breeding, and travelling with you, embedded in your very attire. The concept of putting on fresh clothing and experiencing the comforting sensation of true cleanliness was virtually unknown. Each layer you wore would feel vaguely, stubbornly soiled, adding to a general sense of bodily oppression and contributing to a cycle of discomfort and irritation that you could never fully escape. Beyond personal discomfort, the persistent uncleanliness of clothing played a crucial, though unrecognised, role in disease transmission. Garments worn by an ill family member, for instance, would carry their sweat, their bodily fluids, and potentially the very pathogens that caused their sickness. In an era where sharing bedding, clothing, and cramped living spaces was common, these unclean fabrics became silent, tireless carriers of contagions. Diseases like typhus, often spread by body lice, found ideal conditions in the perpetually dirty clothes and skin of the populace. A single flea, harboured in a threadbare tunic, could be the starting point of an epidemic, connecting individuals across a bustling city simply through proximity. Even if you were among the more affluent who could afford more frequent washings or better quality soaps, the fundamental limitations remained. Laundering large quantities of clothes was always a substantial undertaking, involving domestic servants and significant resources of water, fuel for heating, and labour. The idea of disposable fashion, or an abundant change of outfits, was a distant dream. You wore what you had until it literally fell apart, meaning each garment bore the full weight of months, if not years, of accumulated life. Your clothing, rather than being a barrier against the harsh environment, became a second skin, reflecting and amplifying the hygiene struggles of the Ottoman world. It was a silent, persistent torment, adding to the constant hum of discomfort, and subtly, yet powerfully, reminding you that true, pristine cleanliness remained an elusive luxury in a world saturated with the grime of everyday existence. The weight of dirty fabric on your body was yet another tangible manifestation of why life, from a hygienic perspective, was so undeniably difficult. We have touched upon the various facets of individual struggle with water scarcity, waste, and personal uncleanliness. Now, we must inevitably confront the most chilling consequence of these widespread hygienic failures: the unceasing reign of disease. For you, living in the Ottoman Empire, sickness was not a distant threat or an occasional misfortune. It was an intimate, constant companion, an ever-present spectre fueled by the very conditions of daily life. The filth we have painstakingly described was not merely aesthetically unpleasant, it was a breeding ground, an invisible, microscopic war zone where pathogens flourished, making widespread illness and premature death an undeniable, horrifying reality. Imagine for a moment the world through the lens of a continuous, low-grade fever, punctuated by debilitating bouts of violent illness. This was often your baseline. The absence of modern sanitation created perfect conditions for diseases to proliferate. Consider the sheer ubiquity of flies. They would swarm around the mountains of putrefying waste, landing on excrement and decaying matter, before buzzing lazily into your home, settling on your face, or, most alarmingly, on your exposed food in the market. Each interaction was a delivery system for countless bacteria and viruses. These tireless insects were silent, airborne conveyors of maladies like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever, illnesses that racked the body with severe vomiting and diarrhea, leading to rapid dehydration and often a swift, agonizing death, particularly for children and the elderly. You learned to live with the hum of flies, but each buzzing wing beat was a reminder of the unseen threats they carried. Rats, those adaptable and resilient rodents, also thrived in the urban filth. They feasted on the readily available garbage and sewage, burrowing into the unkempt foundations of buildings, becoming ubiquitous in homes, marketplaces, and even places of worship. What your contemporaries did not know was that these creatures carried fleas, and these fleas were the primary vectors for the bubonic plague. Imagine the chilling, understated terror of waking to discover telltale rat droppings in your pantry, or the rustling in the walls at night. Each such encounter was an unspoken invitation to the very disease that, in recurrent waves, could decimate entire cities in a matter of weeks, leaving piles of bodies and a lingering scent of fear and despair. The plague was not just a historical event. It was a recurring nightmare, its terrifying cycle fueled by the empire's insufficient waste management and close cohabitation with vermin. The polluted waterways, the lifelines for many, became silent rivers of disease. Cholera, another swift and brutal killer, repeatedly ravaged populations. Its spread inextricably linked to contaminated water sources. With no understanding of boiling water to purify it, or the filtration systems you rely on, drinking and washing became a fatal gamble. Dysentery outbreaks were almost seasonal, particularly during hotter months, turning seemingly minor discomforts into agonizing death sentences. Your daily trips to fetch water, seemingly mundane, were literally walks into the jaws of sickness. The pervasive presence of internal parasites, worms of various kinds, was also incredibly common, silently robbing individuals of nutrition and vitality, causing chronic fatigue and debilitating pain, though their causes were poorly understood. Beyond the major epidemics, there was a constant baseline of infections. Eye infections, exacerbated by dust, flies, and unclean hands, were common and could lead to blindness. Skin infections, fueled by persistent itching from lice and fleas, combined with unwashed skin and clothes, often became open sores, easily festering in the humid climate, leading to severe localized pain and systemic fevers. Respiratory illnesses, from common colds to more severe pneumonias, were amplified by smoky indoor environments, crowded conditions, and weakened immune systems due to chronic exposure to pathogens. Every breath, every scratch, every meal carried the potential for unseen dangers. The psychological toll of living under this constant siege of illness was immense. Fear was not just a response to major plagues, it was a continuous hum in the background of life. You lived with the knowledge that sickness could strike at any moment, swiftly and with devastating finality, claiming children, parents, and friends. The grief of repeated loss was a shared communal burden. For those who survived major epidemics, there were often lingering disabilities, chronic conditions, and a pervasive weakness. Life expectancy was strikingly low, especially for infants and young children, whose tender bodies were simply unable to withstand the unrelenting assault of an unsanitary environment. The statistics, when pieced together by modern historians, reveal a population constantly struggling against ailments, often surviving one only to succumb to another. In the face of this invisible enemy, the responses were largely inadequate, lacking the scientific understanding necessary to truly break the cycle of infection. As we will later explore, reliance on traditional remedies and superstitious practices did little to stem the tide. The grand, impressive facade of the Ottoman Empire concealed a pervasive and grinding horror in its cities and villages, a reality where the greatest threat to life often came not from invaders or famine, but from the invisible agents of disease, thriving in the very waste and lack of hygiene that permeated every aspect of existence. It was a silent, unceasing war against the unseen, a horrifying consequence of living in a world perpetually unclean. The grim tapestry of Ottoman hygiene woes would not be complete without acknowledging a foundational source of affliction that plagued almost everyone: the very food you consumed. Beyond the obvious danger of contaminated water used in cooking, the practices of food production, storage, and preparation were fraught with risks, turning the essential act of eating into another terrifying gamble against unseen perils. Imagine a meal not as a source of comfort or sustenance, but as a potential delivery system for debilitating illness. This grim reality contributed immensely to the high rates of chronic stomach ailments, parasitic infections, and devastating foodborne diseases. Your journey to a meal typically began in the bustling local markets, known as bazaars. These vibrant centres of commerce, while exciting for their array of goods, were also significant hotspots for contamination. Food, often laid out openly on stalls, was constantly exposed to the elements. Dust, carried on the breeze from unpaved streets and mingling with the pervasive animal waste, would settle unnoticed on fruits, vegetables, and exposed meat. Flies, drawn by the sense of ripening produce and the omnipresent refuse, would crawl over foodstuffs, tracking pathogens from sewers and rotting refuse directly onto what you were about to purchase. Imagine the vendors, their hands frequently unwashed, handling various goods, further contributing to cross-contamination. Meat was particularly problematic. Without refrigeration, which was centuries away from widespread adoption, spoilage was an ever-present concern. Fresh meat was typically slaughtered and sold on the same day, but rapid consumption was crucial. Butchers' stalls, often exposed to the heat, would see meat rapidly begin to turn, its surfaces becoming tacky, and a faint, acrid smell indicating the onset of putrefaction. Yet, it would often still be sold and consumed. The absence of strict food safety regulations meant that vendors often disguised the signs of decay or simply relied on consumers' desperate need for sustenance, overriding any concerns about quality. Imagine purchasing meat with an underlying scent of faint corruption, hoping that thorough cooking would somehow negate the dangers. This hope was often tragically misplaced. The methods of food preservation were primitive and limited. Drying, salting, and fermenting were the main techniques for extending the shelf life of produce and meat. While effective in their own right, these methods did not entirely eliminate risk. Poorly salted fish or dried meat could still harbour bacteria if preparation was not meticulous. Furthermore, fermented foods, while generally safer, still required careful handling. You might rely on these preserved items, but there was always an inherent unpredictability in their quality, leading to stomach upsets that ranged from uncomfortable to life-threatening. Back in your own kitchen, the challenges continued. Your water source, as we've discussed, was suspect. Even if you washed your produce, the washing water itself could be contaminated. Vegetables and fruits grown in fields fertilized by human or animal waste carried microscopic eggs and cysts of various parasites. Without thorough cleaning, in truly potable water, and without the knowledge that heat could destroy these insidious organisms, consuming raw or lightly cooked produce was a significant risk. This meant that the common meal of salads, fresh fruits, or unpeeled vegetables, seemingly healthy, were actually conduits for diseases like giardiasis, amoebiasis, and a host of helminthic infections, such as tapeworms and roundworms, which would slowly, silently deplete your body of nutrients, causing chronic fatigue, malnourishment, and discomfort. Cooking vessels were also a point of concern. Utensils and pots, often crafted from clay or less reactive metals, were rarely thoroughly sterilized by boiling, particularly in an era of water scarcity. Leftover food, if stored at all, would be in conditions conducive to rapid bacterial growth, turning a seemingly safe meal into a ticking time bomb. The knowledge of proper food handling, temperature control, and cross-contamination was non-existent. You simply cooked with what you had, hoping for the best, a constant thread of anxiety underlying every meal prepared for your family. The devastating consequences of foodborne illnesses were stark and widespread. Chronic diarrhea and dysentery were not just symptoms, they were often states of being. A bout of food poisoning, which you might consider a temporary inconvenience today, could quickly lead to severe dehydration, pushing you to the brink of death, particularly if you were already weakened by other ailments or lacked access to rehydrating fluids. Children, with their smaller bodies and developing immune systems, were disproportionately affected by these issues, making contaminated food and water one of the primary drivers of infant and child mortality rates that seem unimaginable by modern standards. You would navigate this world of suspect food, not with scientific understanding, but with practical caution learned through observation and painful experience. Perhaps you would meticulously examine produce for signs of spoilage, or only buy meat from butchers with the quickest turnover. But these precautions were never truly adequate against an enemy you couldn't see and a contamination cycle you couldn't break. The daily bread, the humble vegetable, the rare portion of meat, each sustained you, yet each carried a lurking peril, making every meal a grim act of trust against an unseen foe. The struggle for a safe, wholesome meal was an unyielding daily battle, a poignant testament to the underlying hygiene nightmare that seeped into the most basic aspects of your existence in the Ottoman Empire. Continuing our deep dive into the brutal realities of Ottoman hygiene, we now must confront one of its most tragic and heartbreaking consequences: the profound and disproportionate suffering inflicted upon the most vulnerable members of society, children and women. In a world perpetually shadowed by inadequate sanitation, the fragility of a child's nascent immune system, and the unique biological challenges faced by women made them acutely susceptible to disease, discomfort, and premature death, adding a layer of poignant horror to the already dire hygiene nightmare. Imagine being a child in this era. Your very infancy would begin in a world permeated by pervasive smells and visible grime. The clothes wrapped around you, even freshly laundered, would retain some of the ingrained odours and dust of the household. Your primary caretakers, typically your mother, would have their own struggles with personal hygiene and limited access to clean water. For an infant, often breastfed, there was a layer of natural protection. However, once weaning began, typically early due to necessity or cultural practices, the child was plunged directly into the full horrors of the unsanitary environment. The consumption of contaminated food and water was a catastrophic turning point for many infants and toddlers. Milk, if not from the mother, would be unrefrigerated and easily spoiled. Solid foods, prepared with contaminated water or exposed to flies, introduced a torrent of pathogens to developing digestive systems. Diarrheal diseases, commonly referred to as summer complaint, due to their prevalence in warmer months when pathogens multiply rapidly, would sweep through communities, relentlessly claiming the lives of countless young children. Imagine the helplessness of parents watching their infant child rapidly dehydrate, their small bodies wasting away, with no understanding of rehydration therapy or the unseen bacterial cause of their suffering. This devastating cycle meant that a significant percentage of children simply did not survive beyond their 5th birthday, with unhygienic conditions being a primary driver of these shocking mortality rates. You, as a child, would undoubtedly witness the loss of siblings or playmates to illnesses you could not comprehend, leaving an indelible mark of sorrow and a persistent sense of vulnerability. Beyond fatal illnesses, children frequently suffered from chronic, debilitating conditions linked to poor hygiene. Eye infections, exacerbated by dust, flies, and unclean hands constantly rubbing young, developing eyes, could lead to partial or total blindness. Skin infections, fueled by persistent itching from lice and fleas that bred freely in their hair and clothing, would turn into weeping sores, creating pathways for more severe bacterial infections to take hold in their small, struggling bodies. Malnutrition, stemming not just from food scarcity, but also from the constant presence of internal parasites, meant that even those who survived lacked energy, their growth stunted, and their development often impaired. Your childhood would not be a time of carefree play, but a constant struggle against an unseen, debilitating world of microbes and infestations. For women, the challenges were amplified by unique physiological needs and societal expectations. Daily routines for women often centered around the home and family, putting them in constant, direct contact with the most unhygienic aspects of domestic life, fetching and managing limited water supplies, dealing with household waste, preparing food, and caring for the sick. Their hands were perpetually exposed to contaminants, leading to higher rates of skin infections and a greater likelihood of transmitting illnesses to family members. Personal hygiene for women also carried specific difficulties, particularly during menstruation and childbirth. Menstrual cycles were managed without the benefit of modern sanitary products, relying instead on cloth rags, which were difficult to clean thoroughly in the existing conditions. This lack of proper sanitation during a natural biological process not only contributed to discomfort and stigma, but also increased the risk of bacterial infections. Childbirth, often occurring in cramped, unsanitary homes without antiseptic practices, was a highly dangerous ordeal for both mother and child. Postpartum infections, including puerperal fever, a brutal killer, were frighteningly common, fueled by unhygienic environments, unwashed hands of midwives, and infected bedding. The fear of childbirth was palpable, knowing that the very act of bringing life into the world could simultaneously claim your own. Furthermore, Women were often the primary caregivers for the sick and the dying, which placed them at increased risk of contracting infectious diseases themselves. In the absence of medical understanding of contagion, their dedicated care, while laudable, exposed them repeatedly to virulent pathogens. The repeated cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, coupled with chronic illness, and the relentless physical labour of managing a household under unhygienic conditions, placed an enormous strain on women's bodies. Their health, generally more fragile, was continuously undermined, leading to lower life expectancies and a lifetime of persistent physical discomfort and illness. The silent tragedy of childhood death and the profound physical suffering of women under the Ottoman hygiene nightmare underscore a critical truth. While the empire was a grand stage for empires and battles, for those living its everyday realities, life was a continuous battle against a relentless, insidious, and deeply unfair adversary. The screams of children, the quiet desperation of mothers, the relentless drain on female bodies, these were the unseen human costs of a world that had not yet comprehended the basic principles of cleanliness, creating a profoundly painful existence for half of the population, if not more. Having charted the intimate, often horrifying, personal battles with filth, we now turn our attention to the Ottoman Empire's great mobile communities, its vast armies, ever marching from one frontier to another, and its multitude of travellers, whether merchants traversing ancient trade routes or pilgrims embarking on the arduous journey to Mecca. For these individuals, hygiene was not just a domestic challenge, but an existential threat, amplified by forced congregation, harsh environments, and the brutal necessities of life on the move. Imagine the sheer, unmitigated horror of illness striking far from home amidst hundreds or thousands of others in equally compromised condition as vivid amplification of the Ottoman hygiene nightmare. Consider first the Ottoman soldier, a symbol of the empire's might and reach. Life in a military encampment was a testament to the absolute breakdown of sanitation. Armies were massive concentrations of humanity, and their animals crammed into temporary, often rapidly constructed camps. While discipline was paramount, hygiene was a distant second, often sacrificed at the altar of mobility and strategic imperative. Latrines, when they existed, were often little more than shallow ditches, quickly overflowing and seeping into the surrounding soil, tainting whatever local water sources were available. The sheer volume of human and animal waste, generated by tens of thousands of men and their horses, meant that campsites rapidly became putrid, fly-infested zones of contagion. Imagine pitching your tent on ground already saturated with the accumulated waste of previous companies, the pervasive smell a constant reminder of the unseen threats. Water for these large military contingents was a perpetual problem. Rivers and wells near encampments would quickly become polluted, not just by waste, but by the churning hooves of horses and the wash from myriad activities. Soldiers, fatigued and often desperate, would drink from readily available sources, ignorant of the pathogens festering within. This constant consumption of contaminated water led to widespread outbreaks of dysentery and cholera, which could decimate a unit far more effectively than enemy arrows. Imagine trying to fight a battle while half your comrades were incapacitated by violent cramps and endless vomiting, their bodies ravaged by an unseen internal foe. The lines between military victory and utter collapse were often dictated not by strategic genius, but by the relentless sweep of an infectious disease through the ranks. Military surgeons and barbers, though rudimentary by modern standards, could do little more than observe, bleed, and occasionally offer some relief to the overwhelmed bodies. The spread of communicable diseases within an army was accelerated by the close living quarters, shared utensils, and communal areas. Typhus, spread by lice, thrived in conditions where men lived in close proximity, unable to regularly wash their bodies or their clothing. The lice would jump from man to man, silently carrying the fever. A single case of smallpox or measles could rapidly become an epidemic, weakening an army from within, regardless of its might or discipline. Death rates from disease in Ottoman military campaigns were often significantly higher than those from combat, a stark, uncelebrated truth of military history. Soldiers who survived the battlefield frequently succumbed to the silent killer of disease in the grimy encampments. Then there were the travellers. The merchant caravans, threading their way across vast arid landscapes or through bustling trade cities, faced similar hygienic challenges. The reliance on often dubious water sources along the route, the primitive methods of food preparation in open camps, and the crowded, unsanitary conditions at roadside inns meant that illness was a constant travelling companion. Imagine arriving in a new town after weeks on the road, exhausted and dehydrated, only to find yourself susceptible to local contagions due to weakened defences and the accumulated grime of travel. These caravans also inadvertently became vectors for disease, carrying pathogens from one region to another, facilitating the spread of epidemics across the empire and beyond. Perhaps the most poignant and desperate journey, fraught with hygienic perils, was the annual Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Tens of thousands of Muslims, from every corner of the empire and beyond, would embark on this incredibly arduous journey, often lasting months, traversing deserts and crowded seaports. The logistical challenge of providing clean water, proper sanitation, and medical care for such massive, diverse congregations was almost insurmountable. Camps along the pilgrimage route would quickly become saturated with human and animal waste. Water sources, already scarce, would rapidly become contaminated by the sheer volume of users. Imagine performing the sacred rites while battling overwhelming thirst, internal cramps, and the constant awareness of unwashed bodies pressed against your own in a sweltering heat. Disease outbreaks were tragically common during the Hajj. Cholera and dysentery often swept through pilgrim groups, turning sacred journeys into desperate fights for survival. Many would perish en route, or, upon arrival, their deaths a stark testament to the unforgiving conditions and the profound lack of basic sanitation. For those who survived, the journey back was often a further trial of endurance, their bodies weakened by previous illness and exposure. The spiritual fulfillment of the Hajj came at an immense physical cost, a pilgrimage of devotion undertaken despite the ever-present shadow of filth and disease. In both military camps and traveller caravans, the hierarchical structures of the empire offered little solace. While high-ranking officers, or wealthy merchants, might afford slightly better provisions, the fundamental environmental challenges remained. The shared water source, the communal air, the inescapable vermin, these elements, levelled the playing field of suffering to a terrifying degree. The empire's mobility, a source of its power and influence, also became a vector for its deepest vulnerabilities, transporting the inherent nightmare of Ottoman hygiene from urban centres to the far reaches of its vast domain, claiming countless lives silently, away from the grand chronicles of battles and conquests. This grim reality painted a bleak picture of movement, where every journey carried the hidden baggage of disease. Having journeyed through the intimate struggles of personal hygiene, the precariousness of food safety, and the amplified horrors faced by vulnerable groups and mobile populations, let us now broaden our perspective to the urban environment itself. In the Ottoman Empire, the concept of public hygiene was tragically rudimentary, turning the very fabric of communal life, its marketplaces, its detention centres, its hospitals, and particularly its poorer districts into overt manifestations of the enduring hygiene nightmare. These public spaces, rather than serving as beacons of civic order, frequently functioned as colossal reservoirs of filth and disease, affecting everyone who moved through them. Imagine for a moment the bustling marketplace, the bazaar. Your modern sensibilities picture a vibrant, aromatic place of commerce. In the Ottoman context, while undoubtedly a centre of life, the bazaar was also a microcosm of the empire's hygienic failings. Food stalls, as we discussed, displayed unpackaged goods openly exposed to dust and flies. The constant ebb and flow of people, animals, including their waste, and refuse from transactions meant that the very ground you walked upon was a living tapestry of accumulated dirt and discarded matter. Animal carcasses, blood from slaughter, vegetable scraps, and discarded packaging mingled with the general street detritus. The odours of raw meat and ripening fruit would blend with the acrid scent of refuse and stale air, creating a truly unique and often stomach-churning atmospheric experience. The cleanliness of these public spaces was not merely an aesthetic concern. It directly facilitated the spread of pathogens, turning a place of vibrant exchange into a fertile ground for infection, particularly through airborne particles and contaminated surfaces. Now, turn your mind to the Ottoman justice system's more dire instruments, its prisons. For the incarcerated, life descended into a truly abysmal state of unmitigated suffering. Ottoman prisons, like those in many historical contexts, were often overcrowded, damp, and lacked even the most basic sanitation facilities. Imagine sharing a confined space with dozens of other individuals, many of whom were already ill or injured, with inadequate access to clean water or latrines. Excrement would quickly build up in open buckets or corners, and fresh air and light would be minimal, if present at all. Without proper washing facilities, and with no change of clothes, personal hygiene for prisoners was utterly impossible. Body lice, fleas, and scabies would become epidemic within prison walls, relentlessly tormenting the inmates. Typhus, commonly known as jail fever, was a notorious killer, spreading like wildfire through the unwashed, closely confined bodies. Imagine the constant itching, the pervasive smell of sweat, fear, and human waste, the gnawing hunger, and the constant threat of fever, knowing that escape from disease was an impossibility. Prisons were not just places of punishment. They were death traps, where sickness often became the true executioner. The empire's hospitals, known as Bimaristan or Darushifa, were often philanthropic institutions, a testament to Islamic scholarship and compassion, and some of the more advanced in the world for their time, particularly in their commitment to structured care. However, even these esteemed establishments could not fully escape the prevailing hygiene nightmare. While some facilities might have dedicated bathing areas or courtyards with fountains, the fundamental understanding of germ theory and antiseptic practices was absent. Medical instruments were rarely sterilized between patients, and surgeons would often operate with unwashed hands, going from one patient to the next, inadvertently transmitting infections. Bandages, often reused, could carry virulent bacteria. Imagine being brought to a place meant for healing, only to be placed in a bed next to a patient suffering from a highly contagious, unidentifiable fever. Cross-contamination within these spaces was inevitable, leading to a phenomenon modern historians call hospital fever, where patients often contracted new, often fatal, infections while seeking care. For patients with open wounds or undergoing surgery, the risk of deadly infection was astronomical, often turning a hopeful treatment into a desperate battle against an unseen adversary. Finally, consider the sprawling, dense residential districts of the poor and working classes. These areas, lacking infrastructure, were perhaps the true epicenter of the hygiene crisis. Homes were often built haphazardly, without proper ventilation or sewage connections. Narrow, winding alleys became de facto refuse dumps, choked with garbage, stagnant water, and the omnipresent animal and human waste. The air would be heavy with pollution from wood smoke, cooking fires, and the unceasing miasma of accumulated filth. Imagine the omnipresent threat of fire in these cramped wooden structures, but even more constant, the unseen danger of epidemics. When an outbreak of plague, cholera, or typhus began, it would rip through these tightly packed neighbourhoods with terrifying speed, overwhelming their vulnerable populations. You would live with the constant visual and olfactory reminder of unsanitary conditions just outside your door, seeping into your dwelling, turning the very place where you sought refuge into a perpetual threat to your health and life. These public buildings and spaces the marketplaces, prisons, hospitals, and teeming slums were not isolated problems, but interconnected facets of a system failing to cope with the sheer demands of a vast, pre-modern population. The Ottoman Empire's cities, for all their architectural splendor and imperial grandeur, silently nurtured widespread disease and relentless discomfort, fundamentally diminishing the quality of life for its ordinary citizens. They stand as enduring silent monuments to the immense suffering born from a world without fundamental hygiene. Our journey through the Ottoman hygiene nightmare has illuminated the pervasive struggles of daily life for ordinary citizens. Yet, there remains a curious contradiction, the dazzling veneer of imperial splendor. While the general populace battled with unimaginable filth, you might envision the sultans, their harems, and the highest echelons of the Ottoman court, living lives untouched by such crude realities. While certainly enjoying levels of luxury unfathomable to the common person, the truth reveals that even within the gilded cages of the Topkapi Palace, the shadows of the hygiene crisis still lingered, albeit in modified forms. This distinction between imperial glory and grim reality highlights not a perfect escape, but a fundamental societal imbalance and a pervasive ignorance of scientific hygiene. Imagine for a moment the Sultan's court, particularly within the vast and labyrinthine Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. You might picture pristine courtyards, lavish apartments, and an endless retinue of servants dedicated to maintaining order and cleanliness. And indeed, compared to the fetid streets outside, the palace complex would have appeared remarkably clean and orderly. Resources, including access to vast quantities of water brought via extensive aqueducts, were undeniably superior. The imperial hammams within the palace were certainly more numerous and frequently used than any public bathhouse, providing unparalleled opportunities for personal washing for the Sultan, his family, and high-ranking officials. Scents of exotic incenses and fragrant oils would fill the air, meant to mask any unpleasant odours and to signify opulence. However, the sheer scale of the palace, housing thousands of inhabitants from the Sultan and his family to countless eunuchs, concubines, servants, guards, and administrative staff, posed its own immense logistical challenges. Waste management, even within the palace, relied on cesspits and limited drainage channels, which, while more elaborate than those outside, were still far from modern standards. Latrines, even within the Sultan's private chambers, were still prone to issues of smell and cleanliness. Despite constant cleaning efforts by an army of servants, maintaining absolute sterility and freshness for thousands of people and their various activities was a continuous, monumental task. The unseen reality of waste still presented a pervasive background threat, even if dealt with more efficiently than in the general city. Diseases, those great equalizers, were also a persistent threat even within the palace walls. The lack of germ theory meant that even diligent servants could inadvertently spread pathogens. When an epidemic, like the plague or smallpox, swept through Istanbul, the palace, while somewhat insulated by its walls and stricter controls, was not entirely immune. Members of the royal family, high officials, and courtiers did fall ill and die from infectious diseases, demonstrating that wealth and status provided only a limited shield against unseen microbial invaders. Imagine the panic and fear that would ripple through the opulent halls if a prominent member of the harem or a young prince developed the telltale fever and pustules of smallpox, or the swollen glands of plague. Even within imperial comfort, the lurking shadow of contagion created an undercurrent of vulnerability. Consider the life of a sultan, or a high-ranking pasha. While their clothes might be cleaner and their bodies washed more regularly, they were still ultimately subjects of an age that understood nothing of disinfection, of microscopic life, or of how diseases truly spread. A visit to the bustling markets outside, even within a litter or surrounded by guards, still exposed them to the same airborne dust, the same flies. Their very food, however exquisitely prepared, still relied on the same vulnerable supply chains, harvested from fields potentially contaminated and handled by unwashed hands. Their water, though supplied by aqueducts, ultimately flowed from sources also accessible to nature's unpredictable elements. The glamour of the palace was not one of scientific cleanliness, but rather one of constant, laborious, physical effort by human hands attempting to keep at bay the ubiquitous dirt and natural processes. This discrepancy highlights a critical social and conceptual divide. For the Ottoman elite, cleanliness was largely a matter of aesthetics, religious observance, and social standinga, demonstration of refinement and piety. For the common person, it was a battle against constant discomfort, illness, and the very real prospect of an early death. The imperial budget, for instance, allocated resources for the grandeur of mosques and the military, but little for systematic urban sewage or public health initiatives that would universally benefit the population. The emphasis was on visibly impressive works, not on the unseen, foundational sanitation improvements that would truly transform daily life. Ultimately, while the Sultan and his court inhabited a world of comparative luxury and hygiene, their lives were still intertwined with the larger ecosystem of the empire. Their wealth could purchase greater comforts and services, but it could not buy immunity from diseases whose causes were unknown. The gilded facade of imperial glory stood in stark contrast to the gritty, disease-ridden reality for the vast majority. But even behind the gold, the basic struggles with a pre-scientific understanding of hygiene subtly persisted. The illusion of pristine cleanliness was just that, an illusion maintained through tireless human labour against an omnipresent, invisible enemy that paid no heed to rank or royal decree. The empire's brightness ultimately cast deeper shadows on the unwashed lives of its common people. As we meticulously peel back the layers of the Ottoman hygiene nightmare, a sobering truth becomes evident. In the face of such relentless microbial assault, the available medical knowledge and cultural practices were often tragically inadequate. For you, suffering from an illness in this era, hope was often a fleeting whisper, and effective treatment a distant fantasy. The lack of scientific understanding, coupled with ingrained superstitions and religious fatalism, meant that responses to widespread sickness were often rooted in desperation, leading to immense and often futile struggles. Imagine for a moment experiencing the onset of symptoms from one of the countless diseases born of poor hygiene, perhaps a gnawing stomach pain and frequent trips to the privy indicative of dysentery, or the debilitating fever and aching limbs that signalled the arrival of typhus. Your first recourse might be to consult a traditional healer, a local hakim, or simply an elder in the family known for their knowledge of herbal remedies. These individuals would prescribe concoctions of various plants, sometimes with purgative or emetic properties, or perhaps advise certain dietary restrictions. While some herbs did possess mild medicinal qualities, their effectiveness against aggressive bacterial or viral infections was largely negligible. The focus was often on symptomatic relief, rather than addressing the root cause of the illness. The prevalent medical understanding was rooted in ancient Greek and Islamic humoral theory, which posited that health was maintained by a balance of 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, then, was believed to result from an imbalance of these humours. Treatments were designed to restore this balance, often through methods that now seem bizarre or even counterproductive. Bleeding, the deliberate draining of blood, was a common practice, believed to rid the body of bad humours. Imagine a barber, surgeon, with unsterilised tools, making an incision in your arm or neck, believing this act would cure your fever or alleviate your pain, while in reality it would only weaken you further and potentially introduce secondary infections. Pneumatics, such as cupping, were also widely employed, creating suction on the skin, ostensibly to draw out impurities or rebalance humours. While some practices might have offered minor relief through counter-irritation, they fundamentally failed to address the bacterial or viral origins of disease. Surgery was an incredibly risky undertaking, performed without antiseptics or anaesthesia as you know them. Infection of surgical wounds was practically guaranteed, leading to horrific suffering and almost inevitable death for major procedures. Childbirth, too, was rife with dangers, as midwives, often skilled but ignorant of hygiene, inadvertently transmitted fatal infections like puerperal fever. Beyond formal medical practices, a deep well of superstition and fatalism permeated society's response to sickness. Disease was often interpreted not as a natural phenomenon, but as divine punishment for sins, or the result of malicious spirits, the evil eye, or demonic possession. This belief system led to a myriad of rituals aimed at placating angered deities or expelling malevolent forces. Charms, amulets inscribed with Quranic verses, prayers, and visits to saints' tombs were common responses to illness. Imagine you or a loved one falling ill, and the only recourse being desperate prayer or tying a magical amulet around your wrist, while the body quietly succumbed to a rampant infection that scientific hygiene could have prevented. While offering spiritual comfort, these practices did absolutely nothing to combat the relentless march of unseen pathogens. The concept of contagion, while observed, was poorly understood. People saw that sickness spread from person to person or within a community, but they lacked the germ theory explanation. Responses to plague outbreaks included quarantine measures, like locking people in their homes or sealing off entire districts. While these efforts showed an intuitive grasp of separation, they were often brutal and lacked the precision to be truly effective. The forced confinement, with no thought to improving sanitation within the quarantine zones, meant that disease often ran its course unhindered amongst those trapped inside. The Kagloglu Hammam, for instance, while famed today for its architecture, was once part of a grand imperial design, but even its advanced bathing system couldn't protect from the invisible dangers. This widespread reliance on pre-scientific medicine and religious or superstitious practices highlights a profound vulnerability. Society was simply not equipped to fight an invisible enemy. The collective helplessness in the face of epidemics like repeated plague waves or cholera outbreaks led to resignation, panic, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Public health measures, in the modern sense, were non-existent. There was no widespread vaccination, no mass disinfection efforts, no sewage treatment plants. Individual suffering, no matter how widespread, remained largely that individual. You faced your illnesses with what knowledge and resources you had, often witnessing debilitating pain and untimely death without any true comprehension of their causes. This brutal confluence of a lack of scientific understanding, inadequate medical tools, and a reliance on ineffective beliefs created an environment where sickness thrived, casting a dark, inescapable shadow over Ottoman daily life and turning almost every common ailment into a desperate, often futile struggle against an unseen force. Having traversed the myriad personal and societal hygiene struggles, let us now step back and examine how your experiences with the Ottoman hygiene nightmare were profoundly shaped by your position within society. In the empire, social class was not merely about wealth or status. It was often the decisive factor in determining the intensity of your discomfort and your very chances of survival in a world rife with disease. The gaping chasm between the opulent lives of the elite and the grinding existence of the poor amplified the suffering caused by unsanitary conditions, revealing a brutal truth about social hierarchy and its implications for public health. Imagine yourself as a peasant, perhaps in a rural village or the outer districts of an Ottoman city. Your dwelling would be simple, likely a single or two-room structure, perhaps shared with livestock for warmth and utility. Access to water would be communal, a shared well or a nearby river, inevitably used for various purposes and prone to contamination. Waste disposal would be crude, often involving a communal pit or simply the open ground. Personal hygiene would be minimal, dictated by the strenuous demands of daily labour and the extreme scarcity of resources. Your diet would be basic, heavily reliant on staples, and your exposure to foodborne pathogens constant. You would walk barefoot or in flimsy sandals on unpaved roads teeming with animal waste and refuse. Illness, when it struck, would be particularly devastating. Without access to private doctors, expensive medicines, or the means to cease work for recovery, your health would directly impact your ability to survive and feed your family. Children born into this class would face the highest rates of infant and child mortality, their tender lives cut short by dysentery, cholera, or chronic parasitic infections that went untreated. Life for the peasant was a continuous, direct, and unmitigated struggle against the very soil they tilled and the water they drank. Now, consider a merchant of middling wealth in a bustling urban centre. You might inhabit a slightly larger house, perhaps with a small private courtyard and access to a cleaner communal fountain or even a more reliably dug well. Your income would allow for slightly better food choices, perhaps less susceptible to immediate spoilage. You might be able to afford more frequent visits to the public hammam for bathing and access to slightly better quality soaps. Your clothes might be of finer material and less visibly soiled, perhaps allowing for more frequent washing. However, even with these comforts, you are still far from immune to the prevailing hygiene challenges. Your household might still rely on a cesspit susceptible to groundwater contamination. Your shops and stalls in the bazaar were still exposed to flies, dust, and general urban filth. You lived in a densely packed urban environment, meaning that when an epidemic swept through the city, you were still very much exposed, regardless of your personal hygiene habits. Illness might mean financial ruin, and the pain of sickness was no less acute for having a slightly better quality mattress on which to suffer. Contrast these experiences with that of the truly elite, the wealthy pasha, the influential imam, or the sultan's courtier. Their homes were grander, often isolated by walls and expansive gardens. They had access to their own, more robust aqueducts, leading to multiple private hammams and fountains within their residences. Waste management was more sophisticated, involving more dedicated teams of servants to empty latrines and clean away refuse immediately. Food preparation occurred in dedicated kitchens, with ingredients often procured from specialized, supposedly cleaner, sources. Their clothes were of the finest silk and cotton, laundered regularly by a retinue of domestic staff, scented with expensive oils. Their primary form of transport would be by carriage or litter, shielding them somewhat from the immediate street filth. While disease could still enter their homes, and certainly did, their greater resources allowed for better care, extended periods of convalescence, and access to more reputable healers, albeit with limited scientific knowledge. The immediate, pervasive, inescapable bodily discomfort that defined the peasant's life was significantly mitigated for the elite. This social hygiene hierarchy meant that suffering was profoundly unequal. The pervasive odours, the visible grime, the persistent itch of parasites, the debilitating weakness of chronic disease, these experiences were magnified exponentially as one descended the social ladder. While a sultan might suffer from dysentery, a peasant might die from it within days. While an elite family could afford new clothes to replace an infested garment, a common person wore theirs until it literally fell apart. The wealth of the few was inextricably linked to their ability to mitigate the worst of the Ottoman hygiene nightmare, often at the cost of unseen human labour, endlessly battling the filth that the urban design of the era produced. Thus, the social fabric of the Ottoman Empire not only determined one's place in society, but also one's vulnerability to its most basic, insidious horrors. The absence of a universal understanding of public health meant that a life of physical comfort and relative freedom from sickness was a privilege reserved for the very few, paid for by the sweat and often the lives of the countless others below them. The Empire's hygiene nightmare was not a uniform experience. It was a deeply stratified suffering, with the poor bearing the brunt of its most devastating, brutal consequences. We have chronicled the daily, grinding struggles against a perpetually unsanitary world within the Ottoman Empire. But even in this grim baseline, there were forces of nature that could push the existing hygiene nightmare past its breaking point, transforming chronic discomfort into acute, widespread disaster. Environmental pressures and natural calamities. The relentless sun, devastating floods, and shattering earthquakes acted as ruthless amplifiers, stripping away even the minimal defences against disease, and revealing the profound vulnerability of a society fundamentally unequipped to manage its environment. Imagine yourself enduring a prolonged summer drought in an Ottoman city. The already scarce water supply would dwindle alarmingly. Public fountains might become mere trickles or dry up entirely. Wells, dug deep but not endlessly so, would draw down to muddy, brackish levels, concentrating whatever contaminants were present. Your daily routine, already a laborious effort to secure water for drinking and cooking, would transform into a desperate quest. Hours spent waiting at a dwindling communal source would yield little. The heat, an inescapable oppressive blanket, would accelerate the putrefaction of organic waste in the streets, intensifying the already foul odours to unbearable levels. Flies, in particular, would multiply exponentially, drawn by the exposed garbage and the absence of any cleansing rain, becoming even more efficient vectors for illness. During such droughts, the quality of available water plummeted, with less fresh water to dilute impurities, and increased concentrations of human and animal waste. Every sip became a roll of the dice. Diarrheal diseases, already endemic, would spike dramatically, turning the dry heat into a literal killer as bodies, already struggling with dehydration, quickly succumbed. Food supplies, particularly fresh produce, would become rarer and more expensive, or spoil faster, adding malnutrition to the list of woes and further weakening already compromised immune systems. A prolonged dry spell was not merely uncomfortable, it was a slow-motion catastrophe, inexorably driving a community towards a mass health crisis by denying it the most fundamental element of hygiene: clean water. Conversely, consider the devastation wrought by excessive rain and flash floods. Ottoman cities, particularly those nestled in valleys or along major rivers, were tragically unprepared for significant deluges. Rudimentary drainage systems, designed primarily to carry away stormwater, were easily overwhelmed. Open sewers, if they existed, would overflow, turning cobbled streets and unpaved alleys into raging torrents of foul brown water mixed with every form of refuse. Imagine water, putrid with human excrement, animal carcasses and household waste, swirling around your ankles, breaching the thresholds of homes and shops, and seeping into wells and cisterns. Floods of this magnitude would instantaneously transform entire districts into giant pools of contaminated liquid. Wells, previously reliable sources, would become poisoned, leaving residents with no safe drinking water. Food supplies, already exposed in bazaars, would become waterlogged and quickly rot. Houses, especially those in poorer neighbourhoods, might be inundated, displacing families and forcing them into crowded, unsanitary, temporary shelters. The aftermath of a flood was an epidemiological nightmare. The widespread contamination of water supplies led to massive outbreaks of cholera and dysentery. Leptospirosis, a bacterial disease transmitted through water contaminated by animal urine, would surge. Standing water provided new breeding grounds for mosquitoes, raising the threat of malaria and other vector-borne diseases. The very force of nature, intended to cleanse the environment, would, in a pre-modern setting, ironically amplify its deadliest elements, bringing a surge of misery and death to every corner. Then there were earthquakes, a terrifyingly unpredictable threat to many Ottoman cities situated in seismically active regions. The immediate destruction of buildings and infrastructure was horrifying enough. But consider the long-term impact on hygiene. Aqueducts, those magnificent lifelines supplying water to cities, could be shattered, immediately cutting off vital clean water. Wells might collapse or be rendered unusable. Worse still, centuries of accumulating refuse and the contents of cesspits hidden beneath homes and public spaces would be violently exhumed. Imagine the earth literally opening up and disgorging raw sewage onto the streets, contaminating everything in its path. In the immediate aftermath of an earthquake, emergency conditions would strip away any semblance of sanitary order. Clean water would become even more critical and dangerously scarce. Bodies of the dead, if not quickly attended to, would contribute to the epidemiological nightmare. Displaced populations would be forced to live in temporary improvised shelters with no sanitation facilities, leading to a rapid spread of contagious diseases. The psychological trauma of such events, coupled with the profound and immediate collapse of any available hygiene infrastructure, turned earthquake survivors into immediate targets for disease. They were left to battle against nature's fury and its subsequent microbial revenge, all without a true understanding of germ theory or the tools to effectively purify their environments. These environmental pressures and natural disasters were not isolated incidents, but recurring nightmares that would periodically force the Ottoman world into an acute crisis. They were the moments when the veneer of stability crumbled, revealing the profound underlying fragility of a society attempting to manage millions of lives without the foundational understanding of public health. Each drought, flood, or earthquake did not just inflict immediate destruction, it sent ripples of disease through the weakened population, often leading to waves of sickness that were deadlier than the initial event, serving as stark, brutal reminders of how utterly at the mercy of both micro and macroscopic nature your life was, a relentless amplification of an already devastating hygiene nightmare. As our sombre exploration of the Ottoman hygiene nightmare draws to a close, we arrive at a final, critical point: the empire's belated and often resistant adoption of modern hygiene principles. While the rest of Europe slowly began to grasp the science of germ theory and implement large-scale public health reforms in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, by then facing its own internal struggles and external pressures, lagged significantly. This slowness in embracing fundamental changes prolonged the suffering of its populace, a tragic testament to a rigid societal structure and a fundamental misunderstanding of the true sources of widespread illness. Imagine the dawn of the 19th century. European cities, driven by increasing scientific understanding and the painful lessons of recurrent epidemics like cholera, began to invest heavily in modern infrastructure. They built elaborate sewage systems, established central water purification plants, organised municipal waste collection, and introduced stricter food safety regulations. Figures like Edwin Chadwick in Britain advocated for vast reforms in public health, driven by a new, emerging understanding that disease wasn't necessarily divine punishment or an imbalance of humours, but stemmed directly from filth. This knowledge, gradually but relentlessly, began to transform the quality of life in Western nations. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, grappling with its designation as the sick man of Europe, faced numerous internal crises. The Janissary Corps, once formidable, became a powerful and conservative force resisting change. Provincial rebellions, economic decline, and constant external military pressure consumed imperial attention and resources. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century brought significant administrative and military modernizations, but genuine, systematic public health reform often took a backseat, seen perhaps as less pressing than securing borders or rebuilding military strength. The greatest hurdle, for you and for the imperial administration, was arguably the profound resistance to new scientific ideas. Traditional religious beliefs and centuries of established custom created an inertia against adopting foreign, particularly Western, scientific paradigms. The humoral theory, which had permeated Islamic medicine for centuries, remained dominant for much longer than in the West. Germ theory, with its microscopic, invisible agents of disease, was an abstract concept difficult to reconcile with deeply ingrained understandings of health and illness. Explanations rooted in bad air, miasma, or divine will persisted, overshadowing the nascent calls for comprehensive sanitation. To tear down old city structures to lay sewage pipes, or to fundamentally alter traditional waste disposal methods, was not merely a logistical challenge, but a profound cultural and ideological shift that most were unprepared to make. While some reforms were introduced in the late 19th century, particularly as the empire sought to align itself with European powers, they were often piecemeal and implemented hesitantly. Sanitary commissions were established in some major cities, occasionally employing European advisors who brought their newfound understanding of germ theory. Quarantine measures were sometimes enforced with greater scientific rigour, particularly to prevent the spread of diseases from incoming ships. Efforts were made to improve port sanitation, crucial for managing the constant flow of goods and people. The construction of more efficient aqueducts and fountains continued in certain areas, providing some improvement in water access. Public health statistics, nascent and often unreliable, started to emerge, slowly painting a clearer, grimmer picture of the actual state of health within the population. However, these reforms were often too little, too late, and insufficiently funded to make a universal impact. They rarely extended beyond major urban centres, leaving vast rural areas untouched by modern sanitation practices. Resistance from local populations, unfamiliar with the necessity of, for example, regular bathing for health rather than solely for ritual purification, also hampered progress. Superstition, custom, and economic constraints often trumped scientific necessity. For you, an ordinary citizen, incremental changes, like the opening of a slightly cleaner public bath, or a minor improvement in a local well, might offer fleeting relief, but they were not enough to fundamentally alter the pervasive nightmare of living in an unsanitary environment. Even by the early 20th century, as the empire teetered on the brink of collapse, many of its cities, for all their historic grandeur, remained far from what you would consider hygienically safe. High infant mortality rates, recurring epidemics of typhus, cholera, and smallpox, and a widespread struggle against parasitic infections remained stubbornly entrenched realities. The Ottoman Empire, in its dying years, bore the indelible marks of centuries of insufficient hygiene, a population ravaged by preventable diseases, constantly grappling with discomfort, and disproportionately suffering from illnesses that its more scientifically progressive counterparts were slowly beginning to conquer. This tragic legacy of belated reform underscores a painful lesson. For centuries you lived with the physical torment and constant fear brought on by a pre-scientific understanding of public health. While an empire could construct magnificent mosques and conquer vast lands, it could not, by mere will or splendour, overcome the tiny, invisible armies of microbes that thrived in its unsanitary heart. The Ottoman hygiene nightmare, a silent killer for countless millions across centuries, ultimately served as a poignant reminder that even the most powerful empires could be undermined slowly and relentlessly by a failure to secure the most basic of human necessities, a truly clean environment. And with that thought, dear listener, we conclude our sombre journey through the unwashed realities of Ottoman history, a reality so bleak it surely lends itself to a tranquil descent into sleep.